Professor Philip Bogus, is the author of a book called The Tragedy of the Euro, of which we have a copy here, and I'm sure these are available. Perhaps there is a small stock, outside. Philip is a professor of economics at the University Rey Juan Carlos, I don't know how my Spanish pronunciation is there, in Madrid. He's written a number of books, including Deep Freeze, Iceland's Economic Collapse, and, of course, as we've said, The Tragedy of the Euro, which has been translated into 13 languages. Next year, his new book, In Defence of Deflation, will be published. So let me, on that note, pass the floor to Philip. Thank you very much indeed. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. Let me say that the book, they are not a big stock outside, but if you Google it, it's free on PDF in the internet. Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. Thank you for the invitation of the EFD group. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here on the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. When it came down in 1989, most people were taken by surprise, including economists of the Chicago School. Sherwin Rosen stated in 1997, quote, "The collapse of central planning in the past decade has come as a surprise to most of us." And Ronald Coase also stated, "Nothing I had read or known suggested that the collapse was going to occur." Well, there was one group of economists that was not surprised at all, the Austrian School of Economics. Because the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises had announced the impossibility of rational economic planning in socialism already in 1920 in an essay called Die Wirtschaftsrechnung im sozialistischen Gemeinwesen, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. So Murray Rothbard already in 1971 referred to Mises as the prophet of the collapse of central planning. So in his 1920 essay, Mises takes on the challenge that socialism would bring affluence. He shows that socialism does not lead to a wealthier society, but rather to planned chaos and poverty. He points out that socialism simply cannot work because it makes economic calculation impossible. Even if it were possible to create a new man, a selfless, completely altruistic being, relentlessly working for the collective, socialism would necessarily end in failure. As Mises puts it, quote, "The impracticability of socialism is the result of intellectual, not moral, incapacity. Even angels, if they were endowed only with human reason, could not form a socialistic community." So Mises defines socialism as public property in the means of production. All commodities, intermediate products, machines, infrastructure, and factories are property of the state. Therefore, there are no entrepreneurs that buy and sell intermediate products, that trade commodities, that employ workers, acquire machines, or hold factories in the expectation of earning a profit. And as all means of production are public property, they are not traded, and consequently there are no prices, no market prices for them. And obviously without prices one cannot calculate. One cannot compare the income and the expenditures. It follows that socialist planners cannot choose the most efficient method of production. As Mises puts it, quote, "In the socialist commonwealths, every economic change becomes an undertaking whose success can be neither appraised in advance nor later retrospectively determined. There is only groping in the dark. Socialism is the abolition of rational economy." Well, let me illustrate it with a simple example. Let's imagine that there are well-intentioned, of course, socialist planners that want to make sure that their subjects do not suffer cold in the winter. They can dispose of all resources, all workers, all resources, and they evaluate three options. First, they think they could build a wood stove in every house and then command in the winter 25% of workers to cut wood in the forests. Second options they contemplate is, well, command 75% of workers to run on bicycles, producing the electricity necessary to heating the house. And third, The planners, who are very politically correct, consider installing solar panels on the roofs of any house. Which option is the best? Well, each option entails costs. Some options use more labor, others more wood, others more silicon and time. Take the bicycle option. No? 75% of workers bicycling here to produce the heat. These 70% of workers cannot produce other goods and services while they are bicycling. The stove option, for example, employs only 25% of workers cutting the wood. But then the wood that is burned cannot be used at the same time to produce furniture. And the forests cannot be used at the same time as recreational areas. And other costs come, of course, with the solar panel. So the socialist planners, they are free to choose the option because they control all resources. But out of the very same reason, there are no prices for labor services, for wood, for silicon, etc. So it's impossible for socialist planners to compare the costs of the options monetarily. The final decision is completely arbitrary. If the planners, for example, choose the stove option, the planners cannot know if the produced heat is worth more to the people than the goods that alternatively could have been produced with these resources that have been used. So is the heat in the winter more important to people than the goods and services that cannot come into existence because so many workers are ordered to cut wood in the winter? Would people not prefer to enjoy untouched forests in the summer or wooden furniture? In other words, without market prices, there are no monetary profits and losses. There is no evidence if factors of production have been combined in a wealth-creating manner or if wealth has been squandered. In a market economy, the entrepreneur would suffer losses if the costs of cutting trees would exceed the revenues from the sale of firewood. But the socialist planners are necessarily blind. Socialism is planned chaos, as Mises says. Needless to add that there is not only planned chaos, but the central planners have to brush over the preferences of individuals and impose their plan. Therefore, Mises totally correct states, every socialist is a disguised dictator. And here in Brussels, I may add, there's a bunch of them. So Mises already in 1920 showed that socialism leads to chaos because rational economic planning is impossible. For 70 more years, communists clung to power, accepting an immense capital consumption and empowerment of their people until finally they had to let loose. So it's for Mises' internal fame to have been the first to show that the whole project of socialism, the idea of central planning, that is to improve coordination society by central planning, is based on a fallacy. As Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto puts it, socialism is an intellectual error because it's theoretically impossible for the agency in charge of implying institutional aggression to gain access to enough information to allow it to issue commands capable of coordinating society. Today, economic calculation in monetary terms is not impossible. Yet, economic calculation is hampered by government interventions that distort prices, likewise leading to chaos today. Regulations and subsidies make economic calculation not impossible, but they severely distort it, impoverishing society. Recall our example of providing heat in the winter. So now we are not in socialism, so there are prices, but the government introduces subsidies for producing energy by bicycling, or regulates the production of solar panels, increasing their costs. Then economic calculation obviously will distort it, and again, with these subsidies and regulation, suddenly an option may become optimal that would not have been chosen in the free market, because it's simply a waste of resources. So, today the threat is not communism anymore. Today the threat is interventionism or statism, a new gentle form of socialism. It is this soft socialism of the paternalistic state that is not only a threat to individual liberties, but by distorting economic calculation leads to a new, more subtle chaos. And today, ever more prices are intervened by governments. Minimum wages, maximum rents, distorting tax schedules and government expenditure subsidies, and above all, an ever closer fitting web of regulations. For instance, the paternalistic state, with his always benignant face, prohibits us to use certain types of vacuum cleaners, certain types of light bulbs. He tells us what we cannot eat, what we cannot drink, what we cannot smoke, which medicine we cannot freely purchase, which methods of production we may not employ, which types of investment we are not allowed to make, and which types of labor contracts or rental agreements we are not allowed to voluntarily agree upon. And if the ever stricter regulations on the national level would not be enough, there has been added another layer of regulations on the European level, which emanates from right here, from all the politicians desperately trying to impose a centralized superstate, a new empire on the people of Europe, a Soviet Union 2.0. Besides this threat, there exists another area where socialism never vanished and is as strong as ever. There, we suffer from massive price distortions, public management of expectations, the central planning of the interest rate and the money supply combined with a nationalized currency. Fiat money and central banking are socialism in money. This system, this monetary system, does not only lead to unjust redistribution, interventionist spirals, cultural degeneration and economic crises, but it also finances government expenditures directly and indirectly. Central banking and fiat money have enabled an enormous expansion of the state. The paternalistic state is sponsored by fiat money. And now we got trapped in an interventionist spiral of monetary policy. The ECB has promised to buy as many government bonds as necessary to save the euro. Interest rates are next to zero. Even negative interest rates are discussed, but the use of cash still frustrates these mental experiments of central bankers. Consequently, we see already attempts to eliminate cash. Once cash has been abolished, all transactions can be supervised by the state. There will be total control, just in order to satisfy the needs of monetary planners that feel that their planning capacities are limited by the zero lower bound of interest rates. The total control of transactions would be a new form of totalitarianism, monetary totalitarianism. So in sum, the Berlin Wall and communism have fallen 25 years ago, but it is not over. We have to be on guard more than ever before. We live in a world of chaos, with immense welfare losses. For civilization to thrive, we have to bring down the new soft type of socialism that thrives in these walls, right here. And we must also bring down the main sponsor of soft socialism, itself a center of central planning and managed chaos, central banking and fiat money. Let us hope that we can soon celebrate the complete fall of socialism.